With the CCKW, GMC and the US Army were onto a winner. Over 500,000 were built, and this is arguably one of the most important vehicles of the war. However, one thing that the Deuce and a Half could not do was fly. Well, it wasn't really a hell of a lot they could do about that, but the Office of Scientific Research and Development took a look at it and wanted to see whether or not they could make it swim. Now, there was an earlier attempt at such a thing. There was a Jeep. There was an attempt to make it fly called the Fleep, and that didn't really work. Then there was the Seep, the Sea Jeep, and well, that technically worked and was built in some small numbers, but it was never entirely satisfactory. With the Deuce and a Half, you have a little bit more room to work with. Enter Rod Stevens, an America's Cup winning designer, and Dennis Pulston under the guidance of Palmer C. Putnam. In only 38 days, they came up with their design. Basically, it was a CCKW that could float. In June of 1942, it was ready for testing in Chesapeake Bay and at Fort Belvoir. The Army, however, did not seem particularly enthralled by this new device and didn't really take very much interest. And it wasn't until by sheer coincidence that a vehicle was undergoing testing in Cape Cod area and a Coast Guard vessel, of all things, ran into trouble, that the demonstrators grabbed a couple of members of the media along for the ride and went off and then rescued the 7 Coast Guard personnel in the rough seas. Well, this did get the Army's attention, and a new round of testing was ordered. Another round of testing followed in July of 42 and onwards until the vehicle was standardized in October, with some 2,000 being ordered. The vehicle, of course, is the DUKW. D for 1942, U meant amphibian, K for the powered front axles, and W for the twin rear axles. Now, whether or not the U had always been intended to be amphibious, or if just somebody looked and said, ooh, that would be a very, very good letter to put in between the D and the K, regardless, the vehicle has ever since been known as the Duck. I've been invited to the Rock Island Auction Company to have a look at this particular Duck, which they are placing on the auction block in September 18. The manual describes the vehicle as being designed for amphibious operations on land and on water. It also states that the vehicle has the characteristics of the conventional 6x6 truck, together with an integral hull designed with the axles passing through and attached to the hull in a watertight manner. Good to know. Now, the hull itself is of a welded steel construction, and there is a frame inside. The various components are attached with sealed parts, and the use of watertight grease on the nuts is prescribed. Now, the catch is that, obviously being a hull, you want to have as few holes in it as possible to access anything, because you don't want to let the water in. More holes, more possibilities of error. This means that maintenance can be a little bit difficult. Anything which ordinarily perhaps you'd lie on your back on a skateboard and slide underneath, you can't do that in here. There's only access ports underneath for drain plugs for the engine, the crankcase, and the transfer case. So now we look at the bow of the truck, which sounds a bit weird, but I guess you have the bow of the tank. It's worth mentioning that there are several pages in the manual devoted to teaching Army types how to speak Navy, with all sorts of terminology that they may need to know should they be tying up alongside a Navy ship. And I mean, the thing about it makes sense, because this thing was designed to unload cargo from a ship and bring it to shore. So obviously it was important for them to understand whatever strange language these Navy types are talking at them in order to work safely together. But as you start at the very front, you do have a splashboard with that lovely warning sign, have you checked your tire pressures? And again, this comes back to what I was just saying, but once you get off the soft sand, you got to inflate. Your headlights are at the front as well. You move further back, you have your Pioneer tools. The hatch for the engine we'll come back to. As you come further behind the Pioneer tools, you got your horn, you have the windshield, which will fold forward and can be held in place by these little clamps here. Past the air exhausts to the hand-operated bilge pump. Now, this is the operation position. The actual stowage position is with straps on the front right of the truck. You come to the twin rear axles, and you're not going to find any great surprises. They're on leaf springs. All 6 wheels have brake drums. The brake system is a vacuum-assisted hydraulic mechanism, the massive reservoir for which is located on the frame on the right-hand side, or starboard side if you're one of them. It's worth noting that the parking brake does not apply to any of the wheels. Instead, it's located just behind the transfer case and basically stops the entire drivetrain from moving. Now, speaking of the drivetrain, you might expect that the power comes from the transfer case, goes into the center differential, from which it gets split three ways. So the two wheels then further back to the rear differential, where it then gets split again. And this is not the case. Instead, there is a split just after the transfer case. And what that will do is send two propeller shafts to the rear axles, one directly into each differential, so you have even power split there, and then again they get split between the two wheels on each axle, so again another even split. Power for the screw, referred to as the water propeller in the manual, comes from a power takeoff just next to the transfer case. The thrust bearing is on top of the rear axle, and there is a support strut just behind the screw. Now, if you want to know what a thrust bearing is, it's where the forward force generated by the propeller is transferred to the rest of the boat, or in this case, truck. Steering is conducted by use of the steering wheel at the front, together with the wheels. In event of an emergency, there is an emergency access port, and you can use a hand tiller. The vehicle consists of four compartments: bow, midships, and two at the rear. There are three bilge pumps provided. One is a gear pump, one is a centrifugal pump. Both of these take their power directly from the drivetrain and are always operating when the screw is in use. The third is the hand pump I mentioned earlier. Now, getting in and out of these things isn't the easiest proposition. Now, there was a ladder that you could have that would be installed, but in the absence of one, well, the best you've got are these small little extensions on the reinforcing ribbing. They aren't big, and I can only imagine how difficult it is in wet conditions. The Duck was rated to carry the same 2.5 tons of cargo that the CCKW was rated for off-road. When fully loaded, there's still a good 18 inches of freeboard, which actually doesn't strike me as being very much, if you ask me, in open waters, but there you go. The manual does observe that in the event of particularly rough water, the solution is to make sure the tarps are tied down correctly and that your bilge pumps are working. Now, you can also see here easily enough the various wooden deck panels or bed panels which cover the underneath workings of the vehicle. So, for example, if we were to lift up this large central one at the rear, you will see the tunnel for the screw, the shaft for the screw, and additional propeller shafts for the winch. All very simple, all very easy to access once you get everything out of the back of the truck. Here on the back deck of the vehicle, you're going to have your spare tire, which is located just behind the fuel filler port for the 40 gallons of 70 octane fuel. Lights, the winch and controls, and then an anchor. Now, the anchor is not a throw it over the edge and moor yourself sort of thing. This is a sand anchor, and the idea is if you've got nothing else to tie your winch cable onto to drag yourself ashore, you slam this thing into the sand, and it should have enough grip, if you hammer it in hard enough, that you can then winch yourself up if you're having difficulty. Further over onto the left side, or the port side if you're one of them, you got a couple of bore holders for jerry cans, and then there is an access port for the steering mechanism. As you can see, the steering mechanism is mainly done by use of cable. Now, the astute of you will have noted that the winch is at the back end of the truck. And well, if you're winching yourself up, you're probably winching yourself nose first, because that's the way that you're trying to get up onto the beach. Well, they thought of that. This is a little pass-through port that the winch cable will pass through, then through the entire deck of the vehicle. Hopefully there is no cargo in the way. And then there is another similar such port under the windshield. Now, I'm a little bit disturbed by this because I have a very great respect for winch cables when they are winching. And, well, I try to stay as far away from them as possible, preferably hiding behind my tank. However, such is not the case in this. If you are driving this vehicle, trying to get your vehicle up by winch, then the winch cable is approximately 14 inches from your neck off your right shoulder. Okay, maybe it's a little bit lower than neck height. I mean, about here. Not very reassuring, but that's the way they designed it. The bow contains two access ports. The small one at the front is for the exhaust system. This is how you access the engine. I do like how the hood is kept open by way of a chain. The engine is GMC's Model 270. It's a 6-cylinder valve-in head, 269.5 cubic inch plant, which puts out all of 91 horsepower. This will get the truck up to a governed top speed of 50 miles an hour, or in low range it'll top out at about 30. On water, when fully loaded with 5,000 pounds of cargo, the vehicle will make 6.4 miles an hour. That's land mph, not knots apparently. Top speed is also officially limited by tire pressure. The 50 miles an hour is only attainable at a full 40 psi. It goes down to about 40 miles an hour at 30 psi, 30 miles an hour 20, and so on down the line. The battery, of course, is located to the front right. It really is a fairly simple engine, very reliable, rugged, and full of fail-safes. So for example, there is a hand primer to pump fuel into the system if it's been idle for too long. As you get yourself comfortable in the driver's cab, there is a bewildering array of knobs and switches and levers to play with. Starting on the far right, why not? The furthest is the front axle engage. So in or out, it will disengage or engage the front axle. Next is your transfer case, high range or low range. Gear shift, well, that's normal enough in the middle, and then your handbrake or parking brake if you prefer. The one next to that is the winch control. So you can control the level of stress on the cable, how much you want to gamble with certain depth. The one behind that is your screw control, forwards or backwards. Sorry, water propeller for the army types. Then you come on to your standard arrangements of pedals. You got your starter pedal, accelerator, brake, clutch, dimmer switch, a whole drain control. Be sure that one is enclosed before you get going. There is, of course, the all-important horn. That's really exciting. There's also no end of warning panels of different things to do for, water operations or your tire pressures, as well as just your standard builder's plate. Now this particular duck is number 17252, so this is actually fairly well along in the production line, and probably the significant difference that I have found so far is that the auxiliary air intake isn't quite as obvious. Now the primary air intake for the system is actually this grating directly behind the crew compartment. However, if you are in rough weather and you have your tarp on and sealed to try to keep the water out, this also means that the air cannot come into the system. So an alternate means must be found. And that is an auxiliary air intake, which on most ducks is a very obvious grill on the front of the vehicle, just between the engine access hatch and the windshield. It's a little less obvious on this particular version, but the control is still here, and there is open or closed for the auxiliary intake. Now the catch is because the auxiliary intake is exposed to the water, you want to be careful not to flood it. So as you are bouncing around through the waves, you're opening and closing this auxiliary air intake to ensure that, well, it's open when you're up and it's closed when the waves are on top of you. The controls on the dash themselves, well, other than your auxiliary vent, simple enough. I mean, air pressure for your brakes, you got your air pressure for the tires. Now again, it's not a proper central tire inflation system, but there is a system aboard, with a pump. Moving across, ignition, choke, remember those? Hand throttle, fuel levels. For some reason the headlight switch here says éclairage, So I don't know, maybe this used to be one of the ones that was handed over to France. Temperature, nothing particularly amazing, and of course a steering wheel of sufficient size that you can hold on to for dear life. I'll just also note that the headlight switch here, as I say, is French. It's not the standard one which came. If you look at the manual, there is a system where, depending on how far out you pull it, it engages or disengages different settings. Now, the manual has quite a long chapter on operations afloat, complete with helpful hints for the Army landlubber, such as, and this is bolded and strongly emphasized, be warned that the brakes have no effect when afloat. I guess you had to tell people this. Also has useful hints like, if your rudder jams, this is how you ditch it. Or if your screw fails, disengage, put it into high range, third gear, floor it, and the wheels will propel your truck along in extremely favorable conditions at up to 2 miles an hour. It also says that in event of complete power failure, rifle butts, floorboards, and other such things will make useful paddles. As well as mentioned, the fact that helmets can be used to bail water. Yeah. Finally, there was a kit that you could put a machine gun for the co-driver to play with, but really just got in the way and they didn't bother.
Two vitally important but easily overlooked controls are under the driver's seat itself. Those control the bilges. Only one bilge can be running at any particular time of the 4.
Ducks entered service 1943, operations around Salerno, but soon it became invaluable, showing up everywhere from the Pacific to the Rhine. A grand total of 21,147 ducks were built, and some 2,000 went to the UK, 800 to the Canadians, 580 to the Soviets. They also went to Brazil, Australia, France, and well, eventually all over. These days, of course, we are far more familiar with them for the duck tours that ply the waterways and roads of various coastal or lakeside cities and towns. In such service, they frequently have their transmissions replaced with an automatic gearbox that's a little bit easier to use and more reliable. There was never really a vehicle quite as successful as the Duck. There were certainly attempts. The XM147, known as the Super Duck, looked a little bit more streamlined. It was based on the post-war M135 Deuce and a half. And there was also an 8x8 attempt, a very large vehicle known as the Drake. And, well, that idea really didn't float. Anyway, that's it, the end of the Duck tour. Hope you found it informative. I'll see you on the next one.